This section is on responses to the Mongol Empire. So just as kind of review, we need to remember that the Mongol Empire is basically, it's too big. They were almost too successful, you could say, so it has to be divided. You have the Khanate of the Golden Horde, which is really closely connected to Russia. You've got the Empire of the Great Khan, which you can think of as being related to East Asia. The center of it is in China, China and Korea. And then you've got the Ilkhan Empire and the Khanate of Central Asia, which we'll examine first because they're kind of the easiest. And they're most connected to Islamic civilization. So basically what happens to the Ilkhan Empire and the Khanate of Central Asia is that they are absorbed into Islamic civilization. Those Mongols will by and large convert to Islam and will intermarry with the people there and will basically cease to exist as a clearly identifiable separate ruling class. Right. So this is a case where basically they conquer militarily, but then they are conquered in terms of civilization. One thing we have to remember about the Mongols, and this is one reason why their empire does not last as long as it maybe could have, was that while they had great military technology and tactics and Genghis Khan was a genius, they didn't really have that high of a civilization in terms of development, right? They didn't have the high culture that could match something like Islamic civilization. So because of that, they over time tended to be absorbed into that civilization, and that's what happens. Those are relatively easy to discuss. Now, the situation in China is much more complex. One of the descendants of Genghis Khan, Kublai Khan, will continue the conquest and eventually unify all of China and will establish what is known as the Yuan dynasty, which will last from 1271 until 1368. So the Mongols will, and you can kind of see this here, they have to adopt local traditions of ruling, right? When they come into China, they establish a dynasty just like China has historically done. So they try and put themselves into the Chinese mold of doing things by establishing a dynasty formally. Now, under Kublai, things are fairly good in China. There's a good amount of peace within China itself. As we'll see, he's going to launch a couple of invasions that don't go well. There's relatively high levels of security, and that means increased wealth in China. So under Kublai Khan, things are going pretty well. And when Marco Polo visits China, it's during his rule, and Marco Polo is just immensely impressed by Kublai Khan's wealth and power, as well as sees him as a generally virtuous ruler. However, there's a problem. The Mongols want to keep power for themselves, and so they do not allow Han Chinese, who make up, that's an ethnic group in China that makes up the vast majority of Chinese people, something like 95% today, they're not allowed to have powerful positions. Right? The high positions belong solely only to the Mongols. So many Han Chinese elite don't particularly like the Mongols, even if things under Kublai Khan were generally okay. And this is going to lead to growing resistance against Mongol rule. Now, the successors of Kublai Khan were not nearly as able as him as rulers, and that's going to cause problems. So the peace, security, and wealth he brought that made Chinese people willing to kind of put up with the Mongols to a certain degree, despite the limited ability of Han Chinese to obtain powerful positions, because they're not as able, resistance will continue to grow. And basically, if you're Chinese, you're kind of like, why do we put up with Mongol rule? They're not doing a particularly good job, right? After Kublai Khan, things get really complex and chaotic. Things start to fall apart. And they don't really give us much of anything, right? We're Chinese. We've been running our country for a couple thousand years by now. We know what we're doing. We don't need the Mongols telling us what to do. We're a more advanced civilization than them. We don't really want them around. And so in 1368, a Han Chinese will be established known as the Ming dynasty. Right? So their dynasty in China lasts less than 100 years, which is not good for a Chinese dynasty. Usually Chinese dynasties last a couple hundred years when things are working well. So basically the Chinese, as soon as they could, as soon as the Mongols got weak, overthrew them. And it's interesting, one thing I want to point out is that Ming In the Ming Dynasty, it means bright or luminous. And the idea is that we went through this period of darkness under the rule of the Mongols, and now things are much better. We had this new bright, luminous native Chinese dynasty in charge. Now, I do want to point out, just going back, right, I needed to kind of tell you what happened. Kublai Khan, before he declares the Yuan dynasty, and this is kind of necessary to do that, he actually subjugates Korea. It actually takes the Mongols several decades to get the Koreans to accept the Mongols as their overlord. And even then, the Mongols don't directly rule Korea because the Koreans are just really stubborn and do not want to accept Mongol rule. So they basically accept the Mongols as overlords in 1270. That allows Kublai Khan to finally feel comfortable declaring his dynasty in China, the Yuan dynasty. Once he's got all that set up, right, and I just want to note these years, right, you don't have to memorize the years, I just want you to get a sense of what's going on. He subjugates Korea in 1270. That gives him the confidence to declare the Yuan dynasty in 1271. Remember, R means reigns. He's going to reign as the Chinese emperor at that point. He's going to then invade Japan in 1274 once he's gotten things kind of stabilized, needs some time to prepare, and he uses Korea as basically the staging ground for the invasion because the Korean peninsula is very close to Japan. He's going to invade twice in 1274 and 1281. Before I tell you how those go, we need to talk a little bit about Japanese history. So I'm going to give you like 500-600 years of Japanese history really, really quickly. But first of all, we're entering into the Heian period. And when you hear Heian, remember, Japanese don't divide by dynasties because they only have one. They've only had one ruling family among the emperors. They divide usually by city, by the name of the city where the capital is. So Heian period is when the capital was there. So here's the thing. The emperor needed the support of his aristocrats, right? He needed the support of his aristocrats. He needed people to help him rule. That's just a given. We've talked about that before. You can't rule a complex state by yourself. So the Japanese emperor is going to give away tax-free land to aristocrats in exchange for support. So it's a really good deal. He's like, here's some land. And not only am I giving you this land that you can have, you don't even have to pay taxes on it. The Japanese emperors, as an aside, also did this with Buddhist temples. We've talked about that before. So the problem is, while that does work to secure the temporary loyalty of the aristocrats, it doesn't do it forever. Remember when we talked about the Zhou dynasty and how the Zhou king gave away land to people, and maybe that kept them loyal for a while, but the descendants of those people who would still have the land would not necessarily be loyal to the descendants of the Zhou king, right? It's the same thing here. So the Japanese emperor is going to lose power, but here's what makes things a little bit different. He's going to stay on the throne. They don't change dynasties, right? They're not going to change dynasties. Instead, aristocratic families are going to rule through the emperors. Now, you may ask yourself, why don't they just overthrow him? Right? You know, if I'm an aristocratic family that's really powerful, why not just overthrow the emperor and then I can just rule directly? Wouldn't that be easier? And that's a good question to ask. But remember, the Japanese emperor is emperor because he's descended from the sun goddess. So that's what makes you emperor in Japan. They don't really share the exact same idea of the mandate of heaven that the Chinese had. If this was China, yeah, you could have overthrown the emperor and said, yeah, that emperor lost the mandate of heaven. I successfully overthrew him, so it's been transferred to me. You can't do that in Japan because you're not related to the Japanese sun goddess Amaterasu. Since you're not related to her, you can't become emperor. Only people from that family can become emperor. So if you want to control Japan and you're not descended from Amaterasu, the sun goddess, you're not a part of that imperial dynasty, you just have to make the emperor your puppet, which is generally what's going to happen. And increasingly, the emperor will be pushed away from politics and focus on religious duties. Now, the thing is, when the Mongols invade Japan, they do not do so against, they don't have to fight like an army of aristocrats. Instead, they fight an army of samurai. You may ask, well, how does that happen? Well, I'm going to explain how that happens. The aristocrats are eventually going to be replaced by a shogun. What's a shogun? The term literally means general, right? The term literally means general. So when the Mongols invade Japan, they're going to be fighting against the shogun, which means general and samurai. So here's the thing. Remember, the aristocrats obtain their money from tax-free manors. Those are in the provinces, right? The aristocrats, the ones that control the emperor, they were given land by the emperor that was tax-free. It's of course out in the provinces. It's not in the capital itself. You can't grow a lot of food in a city. So the aristocrats obtain their money from farms, from land out in the provinces. But the problem is they don't want to be out in their land. Remember how we talked about in feudalism in Europe, the idea was that the noble, the knight, was supposed to be out on the land protecting the peasants? In this system, though, because the emperor is the puppet that you want to be close to control, the aristocrats don't want to go live on the farms, and they don't have the duty of defending the population anyway. They want to stay in the capital near the emperor. But the problem is, if they're in the capital near the emperor, who's to stop bandits or other dangerous people from taking over their land? Right? They're in a conundrum, right? The aristocrats need to stay in the capital to be close to the emperor because that's where their power comes from. But their money comes from the land, which is out in the provinces. So what they do is they hire samurai warriors to govern the lands for them. The word samurai means literally one who serves, but samurai are basically warriors. They basically hire knights to govern the lands for them. But instead of being close to the knights on the provinces, they're in the capital by the emperor. Well, eventually what happens is the samurai, and I'm oversimplifying things, but I have to because of issues of time, the samurai just say, why are we working for these guys? This doesn't make any sense, right? Why are we fighting each other, right? Let's just have all the samurai unite and take over, and then we can be in charge. And what will happen is a man named Minamoto Yoritomo, a samurai, is going to establish what's called the Kamakura shogunate. He is going to take over. He's going to push the aristocrats from the center of power, and then he will control the emperor. Right? Shogunate, it just means rule by shogun. Remember, shogun means general. And Kamakura is just the city he's ruling from. So you're going to have this shift, right? The emperor will lose power to the aristocrats. The aristocrats will use all the tax-free land, everything they have to build up their own power base, and then make the emperor their puppet. But then the shogun, the samurai, will say, we don't need to keep defending your land for you. We're just going to take it ourselves, basically. And then they'll push the aristocrats aside, and then they'll control the emperor. So in Japanese politics in this time period, basically it's whoever controls the emperor rules. Though the emperor, unfortunately for him, doesn't have the power just to rule himself. So what happens in Japan is you have this very interesting system where you have political rule by the shogun and religious rule by the emperor. So in China, you have one guy who has a religious and a political job, the emperor. But in Japan, you have two guys. You have the political ruler who's the shogun and the emperor who's in charge of religion. It's similar kind of to Europe where you have like a pope and an emperor. So when the Mongols invade, it's the shoguns who are in charge, right? It's the shoguns who are in charge. And in 1274, the shoguns get ready to suffer the invasion. The Mongols have come to Japan and said, you guys got to surrender to us. The Japanese say, no dice, we're not surrendering. So the Mongols say, we're going to invade. They invade in 1274 and are hit by a storm. And it destroys their invading force. So Kublai Khan's not particularly happy about this. He's going to build up his forces again, and it tries again in 1281. This time they actually land. They fight the Japanese for a while. The Japanese do pretty well and contain the invasion. And then the Mongols forces get hit by another storm, and they lose. And then they just give up trying to invade Japan. This was really expensive. They lost like tens of thousands of soldiers and a bunch of money trying to do this, and they failed both times. It becomes something of an embarrassment. And what's fascinating is how the Japanese understood this. You may say, well, what's the big deal about the emperor? Why do you need to control the emperor? Why is religion so important? Well, these people believed very strongly in the power of the gods, very strongly in the power of religion. And the way they interpreted this is they said, aha, Japan is the land of the gods. We're a special place ruled by an emperor. He may not have power, but he still has authority, even if he doesn't have power. Ruled by an emperor descended from Amaterasu, the sun goddess. Well, clearly in our time of trouble, the gods intervened to protect us, right? Clearly in this time of trouble, the gods intervened to protect us. And so they called this storm a Kamikaze, right? They called this storm a Kamikaze. Kami means divine. Kaze means wind. Kamikaze. So whereas Korea and China will be subjugated by the Mongols, Japan will be able to maintain its independence and develop this kind of national legend about how they're the land of the gods, and the gods will protect them. Why? Because they're a special people ruled by a god emperor. And they mobilized this idea in World War II, beginning in 1944, when the Americans were drawing closer and closer and closer to the Japanese mainland, the Japanese home islands. The Japanese started putting young people, basically college-age students, people your age, on one-way trips on airplanes. They would load the airplanes with guns, bombs and other explosives, just enough gas for a one-way trip, and then those Japanese pilots would be launch suicide attacks against American ships. This is the USS Columbia, named after South Carolina's capital, and that's a kamikaze that's about ready to hit the ship. And so you can see that under stress, they look back to this legend about being the land of the gods and how the gods defended them in war. Though, of course, in this case, they lose the war. Now, this system will work pretty well until 1467, this system where you have a shogun and an emperor, but there's going to be a civil war over who gets to be the next shogun, basically. That civil war, no one will really win it. And so Japan will be struck by chaos and disunion from 1467 or so until 1603.